thank you all so much for coming out this afternoon to celebrate, honor, and even mourn the imminent retirement of Dr. Peter Staffel, who's worked at West Liberty University for 25 years. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Angela Rabine, Chair of the Department of English and Modern Languages. Dr. Staffel has been threatening to retire for several years now, and I've always said that I'll believe it when I see it. Here we are. Maybe he's going to come through or follow through on that promise. When I asked Dr. Staffel for a short biography that I might use to introduce him today, he indicated that his presentation would include a great deal of this information, so I don't want to steal his thunder. To introduce him then, I thought I might share my own experiences with him as a colleague and friend, if he'll allow me. When I came to West Liberty in August of 2011, I admit that my first few months here were a little lonely as I adjusted to a new job, a new town, and a new set of responsibilities. I was a single gal with 2 cats in tow, fresh out of graduate school, joining a department mainly comprised of faculty with young families. So at times I felt a little out of place. In those challenging early days, Dr. Staffel went out of his way repeatedly to welcome me. He and his lovely wife, Mary Bess, had me over to their home for dinner on multiple occasions, including on Easter Sunday. They took me to Pittsburgh to see an incredible outdoor production of Shakespeare's As You Like It. Dr. Staffel promoted my roller derby team, came to watch us compete. When he learned that I was writing a conference paper about feminism in reality television, he started sharing links to articles that he came across on that topic, which he still does to this day. He just generally went out of his way to make me feel seen and valued and to reassure me that this was a place where I could belong. And I will always be grateful to him for his generosity. Dr. Staffel also has a knack for sharing books he thinks I might like, and he's always right in his instincts. I have a bag in my office overflowing with what I like to call my homework from Peter. And if I polled my faculty colleagues, I'm confident that I'm not the only one with a stack of this nature. And I'll be darned if every single book he's recommended that I've taken the time to read hasn't been exactly what I wanted and needed to read and just didn't know about yet. I recall sitting in an airport in Denver in 2019, returning from an academic conference, blubbering like a baby as I read the final chapter of Rachel Kaddish's novel, The Weight of Ink, and I thought to myself, he's done it again. The Peter that I know and love is generous, thoughtful, irreverent, good-humored, and devoted to what literature is, does, and can be. I fear that it will be awfully quiet in the halls this fall when I don't hear him whistling on his way to the main office to collect something from the printer or make a cup of coffee. He'll leave a gap in this institution that simply can't be filled. It's my sincere honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Staffel.
I'll try to do this just once. I always bitch about people taking things. The secret. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm overwhelmed a bit here, and I really appreciate this. When Angela talked about doing it, my own kind of biographical sort of stroll through my life, it's got me thinking a lot, as I suppose anybody facing retirement does, looks back. And that's, so what I've done, if you have a copy in front of you, I've run off 7 poems that in some way make a sort of have an impact, have had an impact, and continue to. I've put them out in chronological order, but my chronology will be not so necessarily followed as I talk, because I'm going to be jumping around a bit. Angela wanted to do a bit of biography, so I thought maybe I should fill in those gaps a little bit for you, because I think that's important in understanding, for me, in thinking back on it and understanding how I sort of ended up here today. when I was in high school, I was one of those kind of nerdy kids who just loved school. It was great. I know, isn't that great? I always tell my students that, if you're here, especially here, if you're in higher education, you are a nerd by definition because you're choosing to be here and you're even paying for it, So, but I really liked the idea of teaching too, because I said, this sounds good, and I thought, I want to be a high school teacher. And then of course, I also was born during the Sputnik era, which is kind of the old-fashioned old guy equivalent of STEM. The Russians launched Sputnik, and suddenly America was terrified, and the space race began. And so anybody with half a brain was pushed into sciences and math. And I qualified having, half a brain at least. Although sometimes I'm sure people wonder. So I always did the advanced math and the advanced science. So I went to North Carolina as an undergraduate and thought, well, I'm going to be chemistry or math or something like that. And after one semester, it was pretty clear that I wasn't cut out for those. But I'd made a kind of another discovery, and that was I did still want to teach, but I didn't want to teach at the high school level. I wanted to teach at the college level because it was such a fun place to be. Chapel Hill was a beautiful place, but very diverse. And so I sort of, after one semester, and I realized, well, it's not going to be chemistry, and it's not going to be physics, and it's not going to be math. And I thought, well, what's it going to be? There wasn't quite the push then for you to hurry and get into a degree, so I had Gen Ed to fall back on, and there was plenty of that. And I kept having to take English courses, but all of them sort of kind of reminded me of a lot of the things that I liked about about learning. And but what really tipped the scales was when I'd finished, when I got out of it, I said, well, I kind of like political science, so why don't I try political science? And I did, and I threw myself into it and really liked the theory. And then, of course, you'd read the parallel of what's really happening in the world, and you get kind of depressed about that. So by the end of my sophomore year and entering my junior year, I thought, I'd almost finished my major, and I thought, well, I've really got to do something else the rest of my time. I got all these credits to fill. And there was my advisor who had taught me the last required English course, which was an old-fashioned course, which almost every school used to have. It was Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton, the three great English sort of writers, which they are, and they were in it, and sort of the man who taught that was also my advisor, and he said, well, you've got this empty, sort of slot here. You could take another English course. You did fine in my class, why don't you try another one? I said, sure, why not? And so we looked around to see what would fit, and the only thing that fit was an 18th century course. And I said, well, what's the 18th century? Is that 1800s, or, it's one of those things, and I had to be taught, it took me a year to figure out, no, 1700s is 18th century, one of those things. And so I got to class that first day. It was the only one that fit in my schedule, so I took it. And at Carolina, they were in the process of building, and they still had a lot of these sort of old wooden buildings that had been built to educate in a very quick way officers for World War II, and they are long gone, but they were still barely standing at that time. And so we came to this, everybody came into this one room that had a bathroom and a coat rack and a blackboard and a piano, sort of pushed off the side, an upright piano. And we all kind of go, from a music class? And we all kind of checked with each other, because it was a big university and you didn't know that many people, but I knew some. And so we knew we were here for this English course, and so we waited. We were all a little bit early, and then a couple minutes late, kind of like me usually, this big guy comes blowing in really hard, and he's got this scraggly beard. He's young, he's big, and he's got this kind of hair like this, before it was fashionable. And he says, English, whatever it was, 325, right? We went, well, we hope so. And he stayed in the room, and he said, a piano, oh my God. I went, holy smoke. And he rushes over to the piano, throws him down, and starts pounding out this song, and then starts singing. Everybody just looking at him. And he turns around over his shoulder and said, this is from the Beggar's Opera. We'll be reading it in week 8. Remember this. And then he stopped and said, okay, we better get down to business. And he started the course. And from that moment, everybody, and it was probably 35 to 40 kids in the class. It was a pretty big room, and it was full, which should have been a clue to me. He was a man who went on to win all kinds of teaching awards. And he really, in some ways, set an idea for me, was that He didn't care. He did the research he needed to do to get his tenure, but what he was interested in was reading the text and having us read the text. And so he's an excellent close reader, kind of, in some ways, not a new critic in sort of what we might think of in that sort of sense, but just loved to listen to the text. And one of the things that he reminded me of was that all the poetry that I had really read and liked was formal poetry. That it was poetry that adhered to a form, like the sonnet, the first thing we're going to look at today. And the 18th century, of course, is really the last great age of formal poetry. It was dominated by something called the Heroic Couplet, and we'll read one of those, the third poem. I've got part of one. And don't get too afraid. I'm not going to call on you to read unless I sort of run out of gas, and then I may. Who knows? He used to all the time, which is one of the good things about class. You had to read in advance because he knew he might call on you, because he called on a lot of students, and you didn't want to let him down because he was such a good reader, and he made us good readers. And so it kind of challenged all of us. But when I was thinking back on that, I thought, well, everything I've really liked is that kind of formal poetry, so why don't we trace that a little bit? And so where we're going to start is with Shakespeare, with a kind of perfect form, a form that almost is never used anymore, because it was so dynamic in its time that it kind of, I want to say, it kind of ran out of gas in a way. And so if you look in the Renaissance, it was okay. Somebody from my World Lit class should know this. I'm looking around here, but I won't embarrass myself or them by asking them. But Petrarch, an Italian in the late medieval period, created the form, and one of Sir Thomas Wyatt, an English diplomat, really, and minor poet, discovered it while he was there and said, geez, this is kind of cool, and brought it back to England. And in the English found that, in fact, it didn't work quite so well in the traditional form, which is 8 and 6 with particular rhyme, because Italian rhymes better and more easily. And so good old William Shakespeare, as a youngish man, found this form and said, I can work with that. And we see what he has. This is now called, this form that you're looking at on the top page is called the English sonnet or the Shakespearean sonnet. And instead of that 8-6, an 8, the octave which kind of sets a problem, and then you kind of resolve it in the 6, Shakespeare said, I can make this harder and better. And so what he does, he has 3 quatrains in a formal rhyming scheme, and presents the problem in 4, and then repeats it in another way, and repeats it again in another way to give all these perspectives. And then that only leaves him 2 lines. And then he kind of goes poof, and performs this kind of magic. And you go, oh, and he resolves it right in front of your eyes, and it's kind of amazing. And why I want to start with this poem, though, is because this was the first kind of I'm not sure exactly how to say. It was kind of a minor epiphany as I was teaching it. I was in grad school at Tulane, and we had a course. It was kind of an intro to lit that everybody had to take, and I was teaching it in the afternoon in Sophie Newcomb, which Tulane had a women's college and a men's college that had blended, except the kind of, at that time there was still a separation on campus, although everybody went back and forth. And it was this beautiful, beautiful old brick building. 3 stories, I'm pretty sure. And as a grad student, I was assigned to an office over there. And every day at 10 in the morning and at 2 in the afternoon, they served tea and coffee. And you went down to this beautiful parlor, and the ladies who worked there come around with these lovely tea sets. And so I was the only grad student who had the nerve to go down and pretend like I was a faculty member. So it was a great way to get to meet the faculty and all the other departments, because every department was represented there. And I met a lot of free coffee too, which was really a lovely place. But I was teaching there in an afternoon, and it was this sonnet, and given the sonnet talk, and I was talking and starting to read and recite the poem, and I looked out the window, which was right over here, and I kind of was surprised because it was a room that was at least as tall a ceiling as this, maybe even taller. And windows, enormous windows, as so many of those old buildings in New Orleans are, where getting the air in and was important in the heat. And looking out, it was late in the afternoon, and it was just the way the sun was, and I'm sure you've all seen it. You'll look in a mirror, and you'll see not only out and through the window, so I saw this beautiful lawn and the lovely oak trees and the boulevard out there, but I also saw myself. But a kind of spectral image, that I could see right through it, but there I was, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is really interesting. And then I thought of this poem that I was reading. And so I'd like you to look at the poem for a minute. And I want to walk you through kind of 3 different ways to imagine this. Okay, so we notice how the poem repeats itself, and it starts on a large scale and gets more and more intimate. It's a poem that probably, if you teach English, you probably have taught this. It's a wonderful teaching poem. But look at the first line. That time of year thou mayest in me behold. So he's already setting us in a situation, a little kind of narratival situation where there's 2 people. And an intimate relationship is what we kind of think we're going to see. Now, I know you're never supposed to say, well, that's Shakespeare talking. But let's just go ahead and relax that a minute and say this is Shakespeare talking. And the question is, who is the you? Okay. Now, if it's literally Shakespeare, that's a pretty good question, because he wrote this fairly early in his career when he virtually lived in London. His family was in Stratford. But if we think of it, Shakespeare in a more general way, what we see in this poem is we see an older man talking to someone. And he's an older man who's looking at his own mortality and talking to someone about this. And so we see in the first one, he says, that time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few, do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold. Bare, ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. So he sets up this stage where we're outside, okay? And it's, what season is it? Okay, it's fall, it's autumn here, okay? There you go, first mention, okay. We're going to come back and we're going to see autumn and spring a lot in these poems, because they're kind of, as you'll see by the next to the last poem, they're kind of natural for poetry for very good reasons. But one of the things I think that is so funny about this, if you've seen pictures of Shakespeare, what does he look like? What's one of the sort of marks of Shakespeare? Yeah, sort of like me up here, you know? That is a little bit sort of losing his hair up there. And so if you look at that second line, he's talking about autumn when leaves fall from the trees. But when he talks about those yellow leaves, he's also talking about whitish hair. Okay, he's losing his hair. Now this is a young man who's projecting, okay? So when yellow leaves or none, oh no. Good Lord. I thought I'd turn that off. That shows you how, see, I used to tease my students and say I can't have a smartphone because I'm not smart enough, I can't pass a test. Well, that's why I'm retiring. Yes. But one of the things he says, which I think is so funny here, is he just very casually says, when yellow leaves or none, and then he backtracks right away, goes, or few, you know, the comb-over sort of impulse there, do hang upon those boughs. And so we set things up sort of right from the beginnings of a person sort of looking at himself or imagining someone looking at him. In the second stanza, we go to sunset, another favorite trope. As after, in me thou seest the twilight of such day. So in the first one, he's talking about the 4 seasons of the year. A year is a person's life. And he says this person that you see in me is a person who's right on that cusp between the sort of robustness of middle age and into old age. And he pulls himself back from actually pushing himself over into old age. We do it again in the second one, except now it's one day, the 24 hours is a life. And twilight, of course, is that exact same period, that point when the sun is set, but it still emits light from beyond the horizon. And he takes us to that exact same spot. Death's, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self, that seals up all unrest. And that gets, particularly kind of sort of unsettling to call. We all sleep, and we're all of course, it is the closest we come to death in a way, because we're completely unconscious. But by bringing death into it, he's kind of mentioning what that he knows he has to face up to soon enough. The third section, in me again, me thou seest the glowing of such fire, and suddenly we come inside in a very intimate setting, because it's that hearth fire that's dying at the end of the day. So it's the same kind of time period we have. But now we get a fire, which usually we think of as a symbol of sort of vitality, but look at the fire. In me thou seest the glowing of such a fire. And what kind of fire glows? This isn't a blazing fire, but this is a glowing fire. It's a dying fire. That on those ashes of his youth doth lie. And notice also this fire is a his, just for a moment. When we turn to it again, it's an it. But for that moment, he lets slip that his as if he's likening it to himself, which is what he wants to do here. And then we get the wonderful final image, as on the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by, as the ashes fall over it and snuff the fire out. Okay? And so you go, geez, that's really depressing, those three stanzas like that he's thinking about. And then what does he do? He turns to whoever it is he's talking about and kind of talks them into something. He says, this thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong. To love that well which thou must leave ere long. So he's no pressure on the person he's talking to there, Love me more because you're not going to have me for long. You do, right? Which in its own way is kind of funny, and which makes you kind of realize that something else is going on here, okay? Because one of the things that, my little epiphany that I saw it, and I was thinking, what Shakespeare is probably talking about is talking to himself here. Because he's talking about seeing himself and saying, you've got to face up to your mortality. This does come. And so every one of these, if you read that way, as Shakespeare actually talking to himself, you suddenly get a very different picture of him. And so at the end when he says, which makes the last two lines make more sense, when he says, this thou perceivest, which makes thy love, your love for self and your love for life, more strong, to love that well, which you must leave ere long. So you can't get out of this. You don't know when it's coming, but you must fill that life with as much as you can in the time you have left, which of course is that sort of carpe diem theme that we all know. But in this case, it's a somewhat different one. It's one that, that we oldsters, I think someone told me, who is it, Meta Lash, that I officially qualify for, what is it? For codgerhood now. I'm officially a codger. At 70, you become a codger. So what we have to think about. Now, that said, you still have to step back and say, well, what is Shakespeare famous for? Okay, not for being some old guy. He's famous for being an actor and a playwright. And he was an actor. We know some of the roles he acted. And so what I think it's good to remember is that in Shakespeare's time, of course, they could make 25 copies of this in about 10 minutes if they wanted to. They had to write things out by hand, and what they did in theater settings like his own was they'd make a working copy and then cut it up, with scissors. And so your part, I'd tape all yours together, and then on a roll, and right in front of each of your lines, there'd be a half-line cue of the person who was speaking before you, so you had to pay attention. Because in that repertory company had where they do multiple different plays a week, they didn't have much time for rehearsal, so you had to do most of it on your own. So when you think about it, one thing that he could also be doing here isn't, we just talked about looking at sort of see a reflection of yourself in a mirror. How did these people rehearse? Well, they almost certainly rehearsed on their own, right? They rehearsed privately and sort of agreed and sort of conned the lines until they had them right. But if you're somebody like a Shakespeare also, why not do it in a mirror and see yourself and even practice facial expressions and things like that? So I think yet another way of seeing this is to imagine him, in a positive way, that this is him working. This is him with his minor roles. He never apparently did lead roles, but important enough roles. But he's telling us again, reminding us how people like that worked. And so I think there's a kind of a businessy kind of end for that. Okay, enough for that play. We've milked that enough. Okay, now to go back to Carolina, like I said, when I decided what I wanted to do, that meant I had 3 semesters to complete an English degree, and that was like I had to do like 9 or 10 courses or at least, and so it was, as you can imagine, in a way it was incredibly grueling. All those papers I had to write. At some other time, one-on-one, I'll explain to why that was particularly hard for me, not having been allowed to take typing in high school. And still I do it like this kind of, But what it did mean was that I was just immersed in all kinds of good English classes. And it was a big school, so you had kind of every class every semester offered to you, which is one of these wonderful luxuries. So the first class that I took that I really was just stunned by after that 18th century course, was a Renaissance poetry course. And it was full of people like the real star of the show was John Donne, who, if you know, you may or may not know much about him. He's called a metaphysical poet, and that was a name given to him by Samuel Johnson 100 years after Donne's death. And it was not said in a kind way. It was said as a criticism of him. Because for Johnson, why he called him metaphysical was he said, well, he uses metaphor and he stretches them and stretches them and stretches them, and he distorts them, and Johnson doesn't like that, and so he names him metaphysical poet. Get back to serious poetry. And of course, we now take that as a kind of the school of metaphysical poetry. And in fact, one summer, because I had to do summer school too to try to get this other major in, I took a course it was called Course in the Minor Metaphysical Poets. Talk about a niche course. I still have the book, it's down to my shelf. And the guy who taught it, talk about he had married well, as they say, i.e. married a woman with a lot of money. And he made a deal with the university because he was a guy about this tall, bald like someone else we know, and a mustache went straight out the side, about this far beyond his face, like an old Polish cavalry officer or something. And he would come in every day, and he had a lisp. He lived for the whole winter semester in Italy in a villa that they had remodeled. And then he came for the summer and taught full-time in the summer and then in the autumn. And that was his life. And I thought, God, it can't get any better than that. And of course, I married for love. Thought about the money side, but it just didn't work. Okay. But John Donne, of course, is a poet who does sort of push things to the limit, if you know his poetry, and does some remarkable things in his poetry. But he's also a poet who has these kind of two persona. One is this kind of the rakish Jack Donne, and you see a couple of marvelous portraits. I'm sure you've seen the one with this kind of fabulous hat that he has on in this kind of cape, and it looks like he even has lipstick on. He's got such bright red lips. And you go, God, now that makes sense for this poem. And then you pull out his holy sonnets and you go, oh my God. And then you remember that he was also the greatest minister in his day. He was at St. Paul's for the last, I think, the dean of St. Paul's for the last 10 years of his life. And if you go to St. Paul's on one of your trips, which if you haven't, of course, you all will, but you know that if you're walking around St. Paul's, and there's this famous statue of him there somewhere, and he's in his winding sheet, he's kind of upright like this, and you can't find it. You expect it to be up here, and then you turn around, and it's in a little niche right there. You're kind of face to face with the dead John Donne. And it's just a startling thing. But I'm sure he thinks that's probably one of his best jokes ever, one of his finest metaphors. But what I'd like to do is look at this poem, because I just remember he's really the only one I really remember from that class, because he so kind of shook me. I couldn't believe people could write like this. It was so amazing. You get away with this. Look at how he starts his poem. The sun rising, that sounds like a nature poem or something, right? And he says, busy old fool, unruly sun, why dost thou thus through windows and through curtains call on us? Calling the sun, the great god of all sort of ancient peoples, a busybody and a peeping Tom, basically, What an insult. It's amazing. And he carries on throughout the poem because he's got a real point to make here. And again, if you look at it, perfect form, okay, a beautifully formally written poem, okay. And he starts again, we have our seasons in there, okay? And he complains with the sun. He said, you need to go talk to other people about time. I am a lover. And as we quickly see, he's in bed with his beloved, and the sun has awakened him, and he's pissed off about it. But once he's awake, it's actually better, and he turns it into something good. So he first complains about that saucy, pedantic wretch. Go chide late schoolboys and sour apprentices. Go tell court huntsmen that the king will ride. Call country aunts to harvest offices. Love all alike no season knows, nor clime, nor hours, days, months, which are the rags of time. The lover's clock is a clock all unto itself, and it's no clock at all, is saying. Okay. Now, if you look down in the second stanza, and again, very formal poetry, and if you listen to it, you don't hear those rhymes. You don't hear the end stoppages. You don't think of it like, sing-songy stuff, which formal poetry often gets kind of accused of. And it's one of the reasons why Walt Whitman, we can thank Walt Whitman on the one hand for sort of putting a sort of, a knife instead in the chest of sort of formal poetry, but we can also thank him for doing that very thing, because contemporary and modern poetry is beautiful, and we'll get to some of that at the end here too. Two of those. So he turns to the sun. He says, look at the beginning of the second stanza. Look at the first two lines. Read the first line. What does it sound like before you read the second line? Thy beam, so reverent and so strong. It sounds like he's suddenly going to go praising him, doesn't he? But look at the second line. He's flipped them, and we've got the subject in the second line. Why shouldst thou think thy beams so reverent and strong? In other words, he's not finished with that sun yet. Okay, he's going to listen a little more. And he says, I could eclipse and cloud them with my, all I have to do is close my eyes, you're gone. You're out of here. The only reason I'm not is why? Because then I wouldn't see my beloved sitting right next, lying in bed without any clothes on, no doubt, right next to me. Okay? But that I would not lose her sight so long. If her eyes have not blinded thine, remember, unless you're ex-President Trump, you can't look at the sun because it will blind you. Well, the sun, didn't you know he looked at the eclipse? I didn't need glasses. He said, okay, maybe so, I don't know. But remarkably here he's saying, my beloved's eyes are so bright that it will blind you, the sun. Wonderful idea. Look, and tomorrow late tell me whether both the Indias of spice and mine, that is the East and West Indies, where so much wealth was accrued, into the Western world, be where thou left'st them, or lie here with me. Now that's a pretty hot compliment when you think about that everything that's wealthy and beautiful is right here beside him. And of course he's not saying it to her. He says that elsewhere to her, but he's saying this to the sun. And be where thou left'st them, or lie here with me. Ask for those kings whom thou sawest yesterday, and thou shalt hear, all here in one bed lie. So in love is everything, all riches. She's all states and all princes, aye. Nothing else is, which takes us right up back to the beginning where he dismisses all of time because there's no time in his world. Princes do but play us. Compared to this, all honors mimic, all wealth, alchemy. Thou, son, art half as happy as we. In that, in case that's a little problem, there's half as, how do you figure that out? Well, because the sun has to, sort of travel around the world and so misses out. So by the time he gets back, I'll still be here, I'll still be happy, but you'll have missed out on all this. Thine age asks ease, you old fool, remember. And since thy duties be to warm the world, we are the world. That's done in warming us, he says. Okay? Shine here to us, and thou art everywhere. This bed thy center is, these walls thy sphere. Well, I went to college from 1967 to 1971, and that was a sort of a remarkable period of upheaval and change. It's when the Vietnam War was happening. People were, demonstrating. Music was kind of taking off in a whole new way. People were smoking pot and taking LSD and stuff, and so the campus was a pretty crazy place. My roommate was a deep South Southerner. He was from Shelby, North Carolina, or as he would say, Chevy, North Carolina. And Charles is a wonderful guy. He's become a rich banker, so he's done very well by himself. Didn't marry, he made it. And his old aunts would call him up and say, Charles, we're worried about you, honey. Be careful of them communists. And so it was a pretty crazy world in a lot of ways. But seeing a poem like this, it just really struck, sort of chords. But before we get to the real ones that really sort of really sort of ignited me in terms of just sheer poetry, I'd like us to look at this lovely little poem by Alexander Pope, Epistle to Miss Blount, Miss Martha Blount, one of two sisters, on her leaving the town after coronation. Now, Alexander Pope is, 18th century isn't taught much more anymore, and sort of many of the poets of the period aren't. because often they get the kind of bad rep. I've heard it from, I remember hearing it years ago when I was interviewing. Why, it's 18th century, you kidding, all that, that verse stuff. And what I want to show you, he's remarkable for his kind of the satire he has, the wit, the brilliance of his writing. But this poem is an incredibly subtle poem, and it's a little narrative. And it's a narrative that he starts with, as some fond virgin whom her mother's care drags from the town to wholesome country air. If you scan through this poem, people think of it, it's called the Heroic Couplet. It's 10-beat line, or 10-syllable line, 5 beats, and it's iambic, da-dum, 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 and it's rhymed couplets. And if you look down the page, almost every line does have some kind of stop in it. Every second line usually has a full stop or a semicolon. That's standard. Now, if you were to go through, if you read it, and we'll read some of it here and listen to it, it's again one of those examples of it's so good that you don't hear the form of it at all, but the form still gives it kind of an underpinning of heft. And also, what this teacher that I had, this wonderful teacher, would do, he'd walk us through all these, and you'd read it, and you'd read it again until you get this rhythm just right, and it was just like speech. And you'd say, okay, now go through and scan it, and you'd see how Pope had swapped things here, added different feet for meter that would ensure that if you were careful and you read it in a natural voice, you would read it by the meter that was there, and it's really quite something. But what I want to point out here is this little narrative poem, really kind of intimate poem, in which he talks about this young woman like yourselves who's just on the verge of adulthood, almost married. Oh, you are married now. You are married, that's right. Oh, well, it doesn't apply to you anymore. Okay. But these are all, she's a young woman who's right on the cusp of sort of entering society, and she just had her first taste of this, a season of this, and she just wants more. And we see that in the first couple lines, just when she learns to roll a melting eye to flirt, and hear a spark, yet think no danger nigh. Now, spark is a nickname for a young man who's on the make, okay, who's looking to seduce, because a spark sets off a fire, and of course the fire is the passion, and that's what they're out to do. And so she is in real danger because she's not sophisticated enough to realize that flirtation is potentially dangerous, which in this very, sort of very reputation conscious period would be the end of her in terms of any society. So Martha Blount is, we'll talk a bit more about her in a minute. Let's stick with this girl in here. So her mother says, it's time for the country. Well, wealthy people spent their summers in the country, used the hot times. They got out of London just to get away from the noise and the dust and sort of chaos, and they would relax in the summer on their own or a friend's estate or move around. And that's what her mother's doing with her here. From the dear man unwillingly she must sever, yet takes one kiss before she parts forever. And who is this dear man? Well, we're not sure yet, but it's still she. Thus from the world fair Zephalinda fling. Zephalinda, where does a name like that come from? Well, in fact, what you'll see in a lot of this sort of neoclassical poetry is women and men given sort of these Greeky names, the sort of classical names. Well, in fact, there's a not seldom read comedy written at this period by not one of the more famous poets or playwrights that has two sisters in there. And one of them is Zephalinda, and they're modeled on the Blount sisters, and the other's on her sister Teresa, probably. And so when he says Zephalinda, it's kind of touching the space that other people call her by too, you see. And of course Zephalinda is not a kind of shrewish young woman like he can make fun of and play with, because he tells us thus from the world fair Zephalinda flew, saw others happy, and with sighs withdrew. Not that their pleasures caused her discontent. She sighed not that they stayed, but that she went. So she's envious, but not in a negative way. She just knows what's waiting for her. And that's what we get through much of the central part of the poem. What's waiting for her is Dullville, it's on an estate somewhere with no one to talk to, really regular schedule, you ate right at the same time every day, and then you went upstairs. And we get that in some of the way he talks about this. He says, she went, to plain work and to purling brooks, old-fashioned halls, dull aunts, and croaking rooks. She went from opera, park, assembly, play, to morning walks and prayers 3 times a day. You know, you can hear her drag it out. To pass her time twixt reading and bohea. I looked that up. Isn't that great? I thought it was just bohea, but it's bohea. And that means it rhymes with to muse and spill her solitary tia. Okay, it's an 11th syllable, so feminine rhyme, so you drop it and you kind of don't pronounce it. But if you Google pronunciation of te or bohe, there you get it, and you actually hear her say it. So one of my suspicions was confirmed on that one. Okay. So here she is, we're in this countryside, and we learn some of what some of her entertainment is, okay? And part of it is being flirted with by local young squires who come over to check her out, you know, which is, we'll look at the second one, okay? Oh no, let's look at both, they're fun. Some squire, perhaps, oh my goodness, what's that pronoun in there? You. And suddenly, this she and her suddenly becomes the object of this speaker's knowledge. It's a you, it's a real person here. You take a delight to rack, whose game is whisk, whose treat a toast in sack, who visits with a gun, presents you birds, then gives a smacking bus, which means a mwah, big kiss, and cries, oh, no words, don't want to talk, you know, don't want to talk. Or with his hound comes hallooing from the stable, makes love with nods and knees underneath the table, whose laughs are hearty, though his jests are coarse, and loves you best of all, dash, except his horse. Okay? I mean, come on, you know. That's what you do, you know, you have to have horses. Okay? And then he talks about her in a reverie. And this is a lovely bit of poetry. He says, you know, she thinks, you know, when there's no one around, she can sit and think about what she's missing and how she longs for that. And it's a lovely bit where she see her think and she kind of puts her hand here and she daydreams and she almost falls asleep and kind of catches herself. And you kind of go, well, why is that? And then you see suddenly we get another character entering in. Thus vanish scepters, cornets, and balls, and leave you in the lone woods or empty walls. So when your slave, at some dear idle time, slave, well, not, she doesn't own slaves. It means a man who is her slave, who is enthralled by her. Oh, well, so there is somebody else here. Maybe that, you know, there was echoes of it when we started. And the princess tells us who it is. At some dear idle time, not plagued with headaches or the want of rhyme. Oh, poet, want of rhyme. Okay, Alexander. And if you know about Pope, you know of all his illnesses and stuff here too. Stands in the streets, and so suddenly we're transported to the city, and him, in effect, doing the same thing that she was doing. He's kind of longing for another place, except what he longs for is to get out of all this noise and distraction, and be in the quiet country where she is. And she is sitting there, longing to be away from all this quiet in the city where he is. Just when his fancy points your sprightly eyes, just when he sort of sees it, or sees the blush of soft Parthenia rise, gay pats, my shoulder. And suddenly we realize this whole time he's been talking about himself. And it suddenly becomes very personal. And it's all in the matter of a few pronouns. We get all the third persons, and then we switch to second person, and then we switch to first. Okay, my shoulder. And you vanished quite, just as, you know, she kind of woke herself up with the flirt of her fan. Streets, chairs, and coxcombs rush upon my sight. Vexed to be still in town, I knit my brow, look sour, and hum a tune, as you may now. Well, the next poem I like to read takes me again back to those days at Carolina when I was taking all these poetry classes, and of course, one of the most favorite one was, of course, romantic poetry, because you read the five guys, okay? You read Blake, and then you read Wordsworth, and then you read Coleridge, and then you read Keats and Shelley and Byron. Oh, God. And they were just wild and wonderful. Well, the first three are pretty staid in comparison. Blake, you know, completely, you know, is Jeremy here? No, okay, I can't say that Jeremy's here. Because he's just so hard and so difficult, but magical at the same time. But Keats and Shelley, especially Shelley, oh man, now there's some excitement, especially for young men. Whoa, he's great. And this poem, again, an ode, a classical form, fully formal and beautiful. But again, notice less and less end stoppages, so you really read through lines now. And so you don't hear the form. The form doesn't seem to be imposing anything on you, except when you step back and look at it, you see how he uses it to organize his thoughts. So first of all, he calls, as odes do, calls on something. He summons, "O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being." And so here we get autumn back again, and we'll see spring too, because these are going to sort of be the ideas that sort of frame the poem. And he has this wonderful paean and ends that first section of the poem with "Wild spirit, Percy himself, which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver. Hear, oh, hear me, hear this poetry." And that's what the course of this poem he's going to do. Everyone ends like that. He's calling on the poet, on the wind to inspire him. First we get leaves, and then we get clouds, and then we get waves. All of these affected by this late summer strong west wind. Looking forward to, of course, the winter that it's presaging just over here, the north wind coming down. So if we skip through that one until we get near the end, and we see in stanza 4, he kind of summarizes everything, or in section 4, "If I were a dead leaf thou mightest bear, if I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to pant beneath thy power." So he calls up each of the 3 sections beforehand, "and share the impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou, oh uncontrollable." And he kind of again is talking about as much as he would like this, he knows that as a human being, as a man, he can't be as open and free as he would like to be in the west wind, and as he felt he was as a child, because children's imagination, of course, is unlimited, and gives them that ability to think they can do that. They can fly, they can be Superman, they can do all kinds of things. And so when we get to section 5, we see what he wants here. It says, "Make me thy lyre." Just as the trees and what have carried the west wind's music, he wants to be that. He wants to be important here, even as the forest is. "What if my leaves are falling like its own? The tumult of thy mighty harmonies will take from both a deep autumnal tone, sweep through in sadness. Be thou, spirit fierce, my spirit. Be thou me, impetuous one." So suddenly, instead of him wanting to be the west wind, he wants the west wind to be him, because he wants his words. He wants to be a prophet, as he tells us here. "Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. And by the incantation of this verse," my verse, "scatter as from an unextinguished hearth ashes and sparks. My words among mankind." Whew. Okay, if the internet had been alive then, they would have been. See, that's the thing here. "Be through my lips to awakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy." Oh, wind. And here's the thing we always have to have our hope up for. If winter comes, can spring be far behind? So that promise. Let's look a little bit closer right now, although I wouldn't trust it for a second. Now, the course I got out of by taking Romantics was the Victorian. So I never took a Victorian course. Sad, I know. But one of my favorite poems of all is the next one. Okay, "To My Last Duchess," or "My Last Duchess," by Robert Browning, the wonderful Robert Browning. And Robert Browning is probably most famous for, at least I think so, for his dramatic monologues. And this is his best. And anybody who's taught in any kind of anthology probably has had this poem. And it's a wonderful and awful story. It's an absolutely appalling story. And it's all told by the Duke of Ferrara, a historical figure. And it's set in his mansion. And he is trying to negotiate the marriage of a count's daughter. And he's talking to the Count's go-between, the intermediary. And what's so wonderful about it is that he tells you the whole story, and in it you can hear this other person who's lesser in class and probably terrified of this Duke, talking, has lines, but we don't get to hear them, but we hear them sort of indirectly through the Duke of Ferrara. And so he starts off he's in teacher mode, okay? That's my last Duchess, painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. Oh, that's why he's looking for a wife. I call that piece a wonder now. By the way, if you look at this, it's 58 lines long, okay? Which is why we won't read all of it. But if you were to count where there's end stoppage, you'd count only 18 lines. Yet it's heroic couplets. It's rhymed couplets all the way through. And it's so naturally spoken that he always ends them kind of in the middle like that. So you won't think about the need to stop. It's just, it sounds so much like speech because it is speech and it's still extraordinarily formal poetry. I call that piece a wonder, comma, now. Oh, uh-oh. Frau Pandolf's hounds work busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you sit and look at her now? He's asking this kind of much lower person to sit down in front of him because he also wants to direct him, so you can almost see him standing behind him, holding the chair, even hands on his shoulders, directing his gaze. And now we're going to learn about that gaze. Frau Pandolf by design, name dropping, in other words, by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain, since that I have drawn for you, but I. In other words, here up in the private sort of part of the palace, or the castle upstairs, the mansion, he's taken him up there so they can kind of conduct business, but he's conducting business in front of a picture that he keeps covered of his first wife. And no one, not even the servants, are allowed to open it up except him. So he's letting this man in on a very special treat, and we're going to find out why. And seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, if they dared, how such a glance came there. So not the first are you to turn and ask thus. In other words, we can hear the question coming from him. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess' cheek. Perhaps Frau Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much. Or, paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. In other words, Frau Pandolf is not flirting with her, but he's flattering her because he wants to get her to look a certain way, to relax and bring a little color to her cheeks. The Duke doesn't like that. I don't care if it is Frau Pandolf. This is not good. Okay, such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, and he's a master of dashes here, my favorite punctuation mark. And he says, a heart, how shall I say? So he's being careful about what he talks. And now listen to what he says. Too soon made glad. That sort of indirect way of talking. Too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. And then he catalogs where they've gone, and you go, that's pretty harmless stuff, isn't it? Not if you're the Duke of Ferrara, it's not. Okay. She thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I don't know how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name. I mean, now there's a gift for you, right? With anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Well, what are we watching? He's stooping right here. Even had you skill in speech, dash, which I have not. Yeah, this is all, remember, rhyme couplets all the way through, beautiful poetry, okay? To make your will quite clear to such an one and say, and this is his wife, remember, just this or that in you disgusts me. which means literally turns my stomach. Can you imagine someone that that you're married to saying that to you? And to him, of course he'd say that. It reminds you of why it might be better to be alive now. Okay. And if she let herself be lessoned, so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, e'en then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed her. But who passed without much the same smile? This grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. End of story. Eek. Okay, which we don't want to know any more details about. Well, there she stands, as if alive. Will't please you rise? Will to the company below then. I repeat, the Count, your master's known munificence, is ample warrant that no just pretense of mine for dowry will be disallowed. In other words, there's no negotiating going on. Your old man's rich, and we'll come to some agreement. But what's he been doing? He's been schooling this man to go back and tell the Count, and the Count to tell his daughter how she better behave. Or you know what will happen. Though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Object, a thing, a work of art, right? And that's where we end. Nay, we'll go down together, sir, as though we're equals, right? But but remember, we're not. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Klaus of Innsbruck cast for me, Duke of Ferrara. Now you go cast an object. Okay, well, we finally got to the 20th century. Okay, we got two little poems to speak through. Okay, but again, both are in their own way, especially the second one, the last one we're going to read, is a very formal poem. But this one, Wallace Stevens' poem, and I have to again go back to Carolina for a moment. Part of the program was there you had to take a senior seminar like we have, except it was 12 students. It was run like a college seminar because almost everyone in that room was probably going to go to grad school. And 9 of those 12 were really smart, and me and 2 others would just sit there and constantly putting up our jaw. We had this very young teacher in our seminar. They had a choice of them because there were a lot of seniors, and you had to take one. It was on T.S. Eliot and Wallace Stevens, both of whom were sadly almost never taught in university anymore, except maybe as a single poem or two in an anthology. But that was kind of, everybody took them then. And so we had a very young professor who became quite a famous Wallace Stevens scholar. And I knew Eliot pretty well already, but Stevens was kind of mystery to me. And what I discovered in looking back, and I still have my book from that, and we did read this poem, but I didn't remember it until, and Ryan's not here for me to say this, or his dad, one summer before the Highlands, and back in the distant past, we taught summer classes up here. And nobody wanted to teach them, but I lived close by, so I did. And I loved teaching in the summer because the campus there were enough students to make things sort of noticeably a campus, but it was quiet and it's just really lovely. And then everything moved out to the Highlands and ruined it all. But one summer, John McCulloch, who is the provost, called me in, said, and he had hired me, so I was enthralled to him, of course. He's a great guy. And he said, I've got a favor to ask. And I said, uh-oh, what's he going to ask me? God. And he said, would you teach my son in summer school? Is it okay if he's in your 102 class? And I said, what's the punchline here? What's the catch? Is your son really awful or something? Or are you worried that because he's my son? Yeah, his wife sits back and goes, well, he's okay. And so I thought, well, of course he can be in my class. I don't care, He's here. And in those days, the summer classes were about 2/3 full of people from around here but didn't go to school here. They were WVU or Marshall people who were home and getting a gen ed course taken here. And so as it turned out, that class was all guys. It was kind of remarkable. I went, geez, what happened to the girls here? Where's the fun in this class? Because guys, as we know, are notoriously sit and say nothing. But because it was all guys, they were just voluble and they were great. And I had just begun teaching out of this really extraordinary book by a guy named Robert Scholes, who is a brilliant scholar and teacher, especially, he's a great scholar and theoretician. He's a wonderful teacher, and I got to meet him when he taught at Tulane for a semester. And he published a book that was intended to bring scholarly thought or theoretical thought to beginning students, but without using the lingo. And so the book was called, wait for it, Textbook. But a text is something very specific, not just any old textbook, but it was a book about texts. And so right from the get-go, there's sort of, you got to be saying, oh, I got to pay attention to this. And this poem was in there, and he had very few works of literature, just a few that he'd talk about, and then he'd sort of talk about other things. But this was one that was in there, and to me it's such a perfect kind of poem. Because look at that title, The Motive for Metaphor. Oh my God, you mean the motive for metaphor is poetry, right? I mean, that's what poetry is metaphor and metaphorical language. And so what is the motive for metaphor? Okay, it's like a secret that you're being let in on. This is what we study and read poetry for, the motive behind it. And here you go. And we're getting one of those very personal things. He said, you like it under the trees in autumn, because everything is half dead. And the half is the key here. The wind moves like a cripple among the leaves, sort of shuffling, and repeats words without meaning. Okay? That should take us back to some Shelley there, okay? But also that let's remember that first poem we talked about, that where Shakespeare, used that same you. We found other ways that it could be. And I'm inclined to think that he's not talking to somebody, but again, he's talking to himself here. It just makes more sense to me, the speaker of the poem seems to be. And explaining what poetry is. The wind moves in the same way you were happy in spring. Well, what do spring and autumn have in common? Half the four seasons, right? Okay, what are the other two? Trick question. No, not a trick question. Okay, summer and winter. Well, what does winter represent in any kind of sort of way of thinking about the sort of those parallel universes of the human life? Death, exactly. The end, old age and death, the end, And then comes spring, yay! We come back to life. Not we come back, the world, everything comes back to life. And then what happens at the end of spring? Summer, flat, unchanging, hot, okay, all green. When you think about spring, of course, especially here when you're teaching in those classes over there and you look out the windows and you can see spring slowly coming. At first you notice little bits of green, then you see a kind of a green haze, and then pretty soon you can actually distinguish leaves. And sort of, it's a season built on change, and no two spring days are the same, or it's seldom the same. And of course, it's the same. It's exactly like autumn in that way, because autumn starts with the sort of fruition of summer, what summer's been growing all summer, and suddenly your garden's full of stuff. It's great, And sorry again. And then it sort of slowly drifts, and suddenly you start seeing leaves change, a few more every day, and then before you know it, they're falling off, and then they're gone, and it's winter. And so spring and autumn are these seasons of change. And of course, that's one of the things that poetry and metaphor is about, is that idea of things being something else. This is that, when it's not. And we'll look at that in the next poem in particular. But in the same way you were happy in spring with the half colors of quarter things, the slightly brighter sky, the melting clouds, the single bird, the obscure moon lighting an obscure world, of things that would never be quite expressed, where you yourself were not quite yourself, and did not want nor have to be, desiring the exhilarations of changes, the motive for metaphor. And as far as I'm concerned, the poem could end right there, and we wouldn't necessarily miss the rest, except when you read it, it's so good. But there he's done what he's gotten us to the motive for metaphor, what the title said. And we'll see in the next poem we read how the title kind of is the last line of the poem, and it's a frame. And in a way, I can sort of read this poem that way. But then we see what is not changed, the other two seasons, shrinking from the weight of primary noon. What's primary noon? Straight up, right? Where's your shadow? It doesn't exist. It's disappeared. It's this kind of, it's seeming this kind of a static-y moment, isn't it? The motive for metaphor, absolute clarity, shrinking from the weight of primary noon, the ABC of being, the ruddy temper, the hammer of red and blue primary colors, the hard sound, steel against intimation. And what is poetry if not intimation? Metaphor. The sharp flash, the vital, arrogant, fatal, dominant X. And that's what metaphor is not. Metaphor is not that simple X marks the spot, because that takes away all possibility of change. Well, the last poem is one that I remember from grad school because a favorite professor of mine who is at the end of his career and was this master teacher. He taught at Iowa, and he taught at Tulane, and he taught some other places. And he'd come back just because, he still wanted to teach. Don't worry, I'm gone. Don't worry. Okay. And he, in this article, he had written about this poem, and I'd heard it, but it hadn't really sunk into me. And so I've gone back to it, and it's to me, it's kind of the perfect poem for me because it's completely formal, if you look at it, but it plays with form at the same time. And it starts off with a good title, a kind of slightly head-scratching title. Nothing gold can stay. What? That's not right, is it? Isn't it nothing can stay gold? Of course, that wouldn't sound nearly as good here. It wouldn't sound so poetic, So we start with that. Nothing gold can stay, and so you kind of have to think about that for a minute. And then you start off, and if you look down at the poem, every line has a stop, okay? It rhymes, rhymes in couplets. It's a trimeter, so it's got 6 syllables a line. And the first two, if you look at the first half of the poem, we've got 2 sort of mini heroic couplets, let's call them. And if you read them, you'll see they say exactly the same thing. The second one explicates the first 2 lines. And the first line is a seeming contradiction, right? Nature's first green is gold. No, you just said it was green. How can green be gold? They're different colors, right? So you've got something else up your sleeve here, Mr. Frost, and you're not going to fool us. Because, in fact, if you think about nature's first green, it's that little bit of green that's starting to poke out now, right? And what's the season we're just still trying to put behind us? Winter. And isn't that first green magical? Usually, back in the days when we had normal seasons, we seem to have lost them now. But one of the marks of spring was when all the students suddenly overnight were changed to t-shirts, short shorts, and flip-flops. And they were just ready for spring in the first bit of summer, the first bit of sunshine. It was spring, and they had made the change. You can't risk that anymore because the next day we can have snow. Okay, but nature's first green is gold because if you look at those leaves forming as they're just opening the buds, they're so translucent. And what does the sun do? It shines right through them and makes them sort of that pale, pale, greeny yellow gold. But of course, what else is gold? But gold is a metal, you say, and of course it is, but it's a valuable, extraordinarily valuable, and a metal that doesn't rust, that doesn't go away. So it's a symbol of wealth and plenty. So nature's first green is gold. It's gold to us after a winter of cold and snow and everything else. You go, thank goodness it's coming, that season of change. But, second line, her heart is hue to hold. Heart is hue to hold. That color doesn't last. And we see that then. Her early leaves of flower, but only so an hour. And around here, of course, we literally have first green is gold because we have forsythia bushes. You know those? Those long ones that sort of, and the first thing that comes out is their flower. And then comes the leaf. The same with the sort of the dogwoods, the Japanese tulip tree out here. What other ones do that? Dogwoods do? Oh, all the sort of ornamental flowering crabapple trees, they come out with that. So in effect, their first leaf is a flower, literally, because that presages the leaf. So we get the kind of get the metaphor both ways in that one there. But only so an hour. Her heart is hue to hold because she only has it for an hour. And then we get a single line. It rhymes with the next one, but it's a full stop. It's the center of the poem. Then leaf subsides to leaf. Boy, doesn't that sound, on the one hand, kind of peculiar? How can you go from one thing to the same thing? Well, think about what we talked about, spring and summer, how summer is kind of sort of a wall of green. Leaves subside. In other words, a leaf becomes just a leaf, not something new and something revitalizing. And now look at the next two lines. Then leaf subsides to leaf. And listen to, you have to say it that way. You have to say leaf subsides to leaf. Your voice just goes down. Listen to the next two lines. So, in the same way, Eden sank to grief. So, dawn goes down to day. Now, let's look at that triplet again, though, before we leave. So, Eden, we know what Eden is, right? Okay, paradise, Adam and Eve's place, And they messed up, right? But as Milton calls it, they fall into mortality, of course, but they also become human. And most ways of trying to understand Eden, if we want to believe in an Eden, it has to be a timeless place, a place without seasons, without humanity, because we're not mortal there. We're in this permanent state of, we might say, early adolescence, maybe even prepubescence. Because after all, as far as we know, Adam and Eve, they walked around naked and didn't notice. There was that idea of sort of humanity isn't there. So when Eden sank to grief, it did go down, but it also opened up the grief. Because after all, how were both residents of Eden who were evicted, how were they punished by God? Do you remember? World Lit 1 classes, right in the beginning of the lesson.
Pain and childhood.
Pain for Adam first. We'll get to you because that's more obvious. But Adam is going to have to till the earth, toil in the earth in his own sweat in order to feed himself and his family. And Eve was going to have to give birth in pain, to labor. Okay, and so there is grief, but through that grief we get life too, because we get new life and we sustain it with our work. But it's also a life that's going to cycle through, that we're not permanent anymore. All that's permanent is life, the idea of life in humanity, because it carries on generation to generation. So dawn goes down today. Now that's, again, one of these, sort of little poetic licenses here. Dawn is the rising of the sun, right? So how can it go down today? Well, it matches the nice rhythm there, right? Dawn goes down today. And then we get the sort of final, the title return. But think about dawn for a minute. I'm sure some of you get up early enough still in the morning, 6 o'clock. Not me pretty soon, buddy. Yay. But you get up, and if you experience a dawn, it's a remarkable time, really, because you see that change of light. You start hearing the birds. It's silence usually, if you're lucky, unless you're in the city and then you hear sirens all night. But you have the sound of the birds, and is that really light outside? And then you hear the birds say, crap, it really is coming. And then your neighbor's car starts up, or you hear somebody talking, and suddenly you're in day. And you kind of go, oh yeah, here we go again, another day. Where dawn is always special. So anything after dawn is just day. Because nothing gold can stay. So thank you. If you haven't had cake, there's still some cake over there. And I think there's still some food if the students didn't eat it all. I'm not sure. So thank you very much for coming. And for being my colleagues and friends and students, poor things.